Hi, we're ready for essayette number 3. Last time we disposed of belief. This is its natural counterpart, skepticism. And I guess I think of skepticism in relation to belief in terms of performance, kind of the way some wise religious people think about doubt in relation to faith. That is, it's not something to be suppressed or ignored or denied, but something to be allowed into the process and dealt with. And then I'm told it becomes part of faith, or at least a test of faith. And I think skepticism and belief are kind of in that relationship to each other. So this is a fairly short essayette. But then we have some questions that I will be responding to. So I'll just read the essay and then we'll get to the questions. Number 3, skepticism. Skepticism is the guard against an indiscriminate credulity. Many people believe many things. Often their convictions are strong and their persuasive talents advanced. The very qualities of sensory refinement and emotional availability, so necessary to the artistic personality, are also indicators of an easy suggestibility. Something must caution us against following the little man with the Napoleon delusion into battle. Skepticism would seem to be a function primarily of the intellect, and indeed its practice consists mostly of marshalling arguments against belief. But no more than creativity itself does it originate in reason. Suspicion is not more rational than vision and is just as primal. At the snap of a twig, the ears prick. Then the reason goes to work. The skeptical response is the beginning of the critical process. Criticism holds that matters of belief are too important to go unexamined. It seeks liberation, not from belief, but from unexplored assumptions of belief. It relies on a willingness to adopt, at least provisionally, an alternative point of view, a perspective. The very being of the modern Western arts owes much to the search for such perspective, for a worldview that allows possibilities outside the church-state absolutes of medieval Christendom. Certainly this is true of opera, born of a conscious, willed resurrection of the worlds of Greco-Roman myth and history. But if art has become the instrument of perspective on religious and political convictions, and has won its right to propose its own truths about these and other matters pertinent to the human condition, it must itself submit to critical examination. The acts and beliefs of artists cannot be presumed more worthy of credence than those of priests and kings, and a tyranny of art, with the cultish and slavish responses it so easily induces, and with its own sets of treasonous or heretical acts, is an improvement on one of state or church only in the relative mildness of the punishments it exacts. That is why criticism must exist, and why its function must not become constructive or promotional, as it is so often asked to be by artists and their devotees. The critical mandate extends not merely to a scrutiny of specific acts or works within an artistic style or form, but to the risk of questioning the form itself, the belief system as a whole, together with all its institutions. Skepticism also has an important task within the creative process, where it takes the form of self-criticism. That is where it is constructive. It is also a crucial component in the makeup of an active, sentient receptor, whose predisposition to believe it insistently questions. The devotee in search of fulfillment trusts both his belief and his skepticism, and lives happily with the paradox. That is the end of essayette number 3. So I have several questions here. They're one question, but they sort of have 3 parts, posed by Jennifer. She asks, you claim that an important function of criticism is as a guard against art becoming authoritarian. What do you mean by that? Any examples you'd care to cite? And as a critic yourself, tell us a bit more about how you see the aims and effects of your criticism and the role of criticism in general. So, as I say, there are several parts to that question. I'll deal with the aspect of the possible authoritarian uses of art first. The most important power that exists is the power to influence what people believe, to shape their worldview. If you can do that, you can govern, at least within broad limits, their behavior. And any of us who have lived through the past 6 months here in the USA shouldn't need any examples of that. But to lengthen out the time frame a little, let me offer a very rough, oversimplified thumbnail history of the Western arts. And for all the revisionist arguments about how dark the Dark Ages really weren't, I think this still stands. That for many centuries, all ways of thought and belief in the West were effectively delimited by the sometimes fractious alliances between church and state, which were also the sources of patronage for artists of all kinds. So artistic expression reflected that big time. Then, beginning with a sort of proto-Renaissance in the 11th and 12th centuries, that's where the meta-narrative I've spoken of was born. And then with greater force in what we think of as the Renaissance, and think about the birth of opera in the late Renaissance, about the subject matter of all of Baroque opera, all those tall tales of Greco-Roman gods and goddesses. And of course, we were still good Judeo-Christians, but in a sense, that was sort of sticking it to the man in religious terms. And think too of the breakout of singing, from strictly ecclesiastical to theatrical purposes. And then, even more with the Enlightenment and the freer flow of information and ideas and an exponential growth of literacy, those limits were vastly extended and alternate ways of belief and behavior introduced. And the arts, now much more secularized and ecumenical and diversified, and including this thing called opera, were central to that. And so their role in influencing belief and behavior, which had always been crucial in their service to church and state, now reflected those developments. And they declared themselves independent, answerable only to their own sets of values and their own laws, about which, however, there were many disagreements. Enter criticism. You ask for examples of this persuasive power that can turn authoritarian and that can actually restrict our thinking and imagining rather than freeing them. And I can give you two large ones on the macro level. One within our own art form is the rise of postmodern conceptualism in the production of opera, how it looks, how its stories are told, how its characters behave, which amounts to nothing less than the demolition of the ways of thought and belief and behavior, the value sets of the artists who created this magnificent chunk of our cultural legacy. Criticism should have a lot to say about that, but instead usually just buys into it. Another, even wider in scope, is the total conquest of the cultural commons by the metastasis of popular entertainment. Those aesthetics, that subject matter, the ways of thought and feeling, the implied values that are force-fed to us now from birth, that have disarming means of persuasion at their disposal and are truly inescapable, a kind of ubiquitous propaganda of cultural devolution. Criticism should have even more to say about that, but has instead, for the most part, collapsed into it. You also inquire about the uses of criticism in general. We can't really do more than skim that here, and I emphasize that I'm speaking of performance criticism, which is in the journalistic sphere, as distinct from the scholarly or academic variety. But I guess I'd offer three areas of consideration. One is what I think of as being in the vertical dimension, down through time. And that is making a record, continuing the history, a history of both the events themselves, this or that happened, but also of opinion and reaction, how the events went down with more or less qualified commentators. Of course, that assumes an interest in the history of the things we deem meaningful, in what inspired this legacy and thought and brought us to where we are. And I personally have trouble understanding people who have no such interest. A second, out into the lateral dimension of the present, is to create an atmosphere of argumentation, of spirited exchange of informed opinion and evaluation around the art form and all the events that occur within it, which automatically confers upon it the dignity of something worth arguing about. In that regard, I often think of a passage in a collection of essays by Stanley Kaufman, certainly one of our 4 or 5 best theater critics of the past 60 or 70 years. Kaufman reports speaking with the artistic director of one of the important German theaters about his theater and its situation in its city. One of the director's complaints being that the criticism was bad, by which he did not mean that it was negative, but that it wasn't knowledgeable enough, not stimulating enough, controversial enough to establish an environment of intellectual excitement and importance around the theater. And third, in these uses of criticism, I'd cite some guidance as to where responsibility lies for the effect made by an artistic event, how wide the gap and exactly where it falls between what is in a work and what is or is not realized in performance. The failure of criticism to help people recognize that, to learn what to listen for, what to watch for, has in my lifetime been perhaps its greatest failure. And finally, you asked about my own life in criticism. The rather forlorn truth about that is that the single most obvious observation I can make is that I have lived to watch performance criticism disappear. I'm sure most of you younger viewers are aware of the shrinkage of newspaper and magazine outlets for performance criticism, along with much else, of course. But I'm not sure you can appreciate the dampening effect that's had on our art form, on all of the high culture arts in particular. We do have all the online activity, and I'm not knocking it. Some of it is quite entertainingly written and knowledgeable in some areas. But little of it that I know about, at least, amounts to what I'd call actual criticism. And almost none of it is vetted, or indeed ever has been. And almost none of it is monetized, which means that is, strictly speaking, amateur, avocational. And that raises the interesting question of credentialing. And there I can share some of my early experience with you, since I started quite young and went on a pathway that was uncommon then and now no longer exists. Just as I was getting out of the Army at age 23, and with a recommendation from a friend, a Yale professor who occasionally wrote for Opera News, I submitted a couple of pieces there. And they were accepted, and then I was given a few reviewing assignments. And on the strength of that, I got an associate editor position at the Music Journal. It kept me off the streets, and then sent 1 or 2 things off to High Fidelity, the leading American magazine about recordings and recording equipment and classical music, which had a pretty impressive lineup of regular reviewers, each generally responsible for a particular area of the whole repertoire. They couldn't make use of the articles I'd sent, but they liked my writing. And when I say they, here's what I mean by vetting. High Fidelity's music editor was Roland Gillette, who'd recently come over from the Saturday Review, a highly respected magazine of an upper middle brow sort that doesn't exist anymore, and was the author of what is still the best book on the birth and growth of the recording industry up to that time, called The Fabulous Phonograph. As it happened, the magazine had just parted ways with their principal opera reviewer, so Roland consulted with a couple of other people on the editorial staff and they asked me if I'd be willing to pick out some recent opera recording and send in a sort of dry run review. I figured there was nothing to lose, so I took a slightly condensed recording of Boito's Mephistopheles, starring Boris Christoph and conducted by Vittorio Gui, and wrote it up, comparing it, I believe, with the great old Columbia set. And they said, okay, he seems to know something about opera and about singing, and he can write. So why don't we try him out on a couple of things? And they did, and then they took me on, and the magazine grew explosively in the next few years, and I became a sort of star reviewer, and other good things began to happen. So while one often hears the phrase self-appointed applied to critics, and this could often be accurately said of our bloggers, my point is that I and others who wrote for the platforms that we had then were in fact appointed by others, hired, in fact, by experienced professional editors answerable to their readers and publishers. Guarantees nothing, mind you, but it does set in place some level of vetting, of screening. It's rather like an audition, isn't it? Anyone can claim to be a singer, but to get anywhere in the business, someone else has to say it too. But here's an interesting thing about this process of credentialing. No one ever asked me for a credential, never asked for a resume, never asked, for instance, what college or university I'd gone to or what degrees I had, which was lucky because the answer would have been none. My writing and the knowledge it implied was the credential and led to everything else. If someone had asked me what I'd done for myself with the 7 years since graduating from high school, I would have mumbled something about 6 years of private vocal study, about 3 years worth of professional acting experience, 2 years of Italian and German classes at Columbia School of General Studies, that is night school, enlisted man in the Army, several kinds of day jobs like secretarial work, toy demonstration, proofreading, and very intensive attendance at opera, theater, and dance performance in New York City, and lots of reading. So I missed some of the things I would have gotten from continuing into higher education, but learned others that turned out to be useful to my several subsequent careers. Well, that world is gone. It was a world that assumed a passionately devoted readership, willing to follow a critic into the weeds of his specialty and to pay something for the journey. And it was set in the context of an environment of performance and recording that was feverishly churning and growing, and which we all took more or less for granted. I hardly recognize it when I have occasion to look back at it. Searching for something else recently, I came across the figure for High Fidelity's peak of circulation sometime in the 1970s. It was, according to this claim, around 400,000 in a total population approximately 2/3 of today's. Imagine that. Next up will be essayette number 4, Engagement and Distance. See you then.